Good morning. My name is Lene Palmisano, and I'm going to call this meeting of the Transportation Public Works Committee to order today. We're just waiting on our chair, but we have a quorum, and we can do the business of this committee. With us today are Councilmembers Yang, Councilmember Glidden, Councilmember Bender, and Councilmember Gordon. First, let me read through the consent items on the agenda today, and then we'll start the public hearing. We have an MOU with the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization for stormwater management improvements in Northeast Minneapolis with the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board. We have a mattress collection and recycling agreement. Item number 4 is a master partnership agreement with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Item number 5 is the Minneapolis Open Streets Organizer Selection and Agreement for the next 2 years. Item number 6 is a contract with the City of Bloomington for the purchase of water from Minneapolis. Item number 7 is a contract amendment for the St. Anthony Parkway Bridge project. Item number 8 is the Northern Lights Express Joint Powers Agreement and cost participation. Item number 9 is also Northern Lights Express Tier 2 environmental assessment. Item number 10, water service line repair assessment removal for 3609 Aldrich Avenue South. We have the Minneapolis Downtown Business Improvement District and Nicollet Mall reconstruction project assessment for removal of 350 Park. We have 4th Street Southeast street reconstruction and street lighting project assessment reduction for 2813 4th Street Southeast. We have sale of a vacated alley at 2011 and a half Lake Street East to Special School District Number 1. We have 26th Street East West and 28th Street East West protected bikeway from Hennepin to Portland, a variance request from MSA Standards and Layout Approval. We have 61st Street West street reconstruction layout approval. We have the bid for construction of the ABC parking ramp LED lighting project. We have a bid for variable message signs and communications hardware, and a bid for cleaning large diameter stormwater sewer systems. Any questions or anyone want to pull any of those items? Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make a brief comment on item number 14.
Please do.
Thank you. This is one of a number of protected bikeway projects that are being implemented this year. Just wanted to comment because there's been a lot of community engagement about this. We had a total of 3 public meetings during the planning phase a couple of years ago, and then another public meeting plus a meeting with the business community and a lot of outreach to individual property owners and businesses and land users like a church nearby. So I just wanted to thank staff for all of the extra attention and effort that went into engaging with the details of this project. I'm really excited to see the extension of this protected bikeway through the ward. It ends now right up as the freeway begins, and I often hear from constituents who've been anxious for this to go through. So it was not without a lot of discussion, but I appreciate all of the work again, and I'm really supportive of this project. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on any of the other items? All those in favor of passing the consent agenda, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Next, I'd like to move to the public hearing. We have the Penn Oliver Concrete Streets Rehabilitation Program, project approval and assessment. Do we have anyone signed in?
Madam Chair, Vice Chair, I'd like to welcome Ole Mosinger, who's going to present this item for you, Ole's with Transportation Engineering and Design.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Vice Chair, Council members. My name is Ole Mersinger, Project Engineer with Transportation Engineering Design. Today's item is the Penn Oliver Concrete Street Rehabilitation Project hearing and project approval. On March 10th, 2017, City Council designated the streets and improvements as part of the Penn Oliver project. Streets included within the project include Plain Avenue south between West Lake of the Isles Parkway and Franklin Avenue, and Oliver Avenue south between Franklin Avenue and Douglas Avenue. The road within the project is approaching 50 years of age, and this project will extend its lifespan of the pavement. Work on the pavement will consist of removing defective joints between the concrete panels in the roadway and replacing it with new concrete. Other work includes partial and full concrete panel replacement where smaller repairs are not viable. The entire roadway surface will then be diamond ground and to a smooth surface at the conclusion of the project. The work is also being coordinated with some utility work, specifically with some storm sewer upgrades and also some gas upgrades by CenterPoint. The construction estimate is $1 million, of which $96,250 would be funded with assessments and the remainder with net debt bonds. The assessments were calculated using the 2017 Uniform Assessment Rate for resurfacing projects of 65 cents per square foot for non-residential properties and 22 cents a square foot for residential properties. Project staff presented the project at 2 neighborhood meetings. Staff attended the April 25th, Kenwood Isles Area Association meeting and a pre-assessment neighborhood meeting on May 9th. Staff is recommending passage of resolution ordering the work to proceed and adopting special assessments amount of $96,252.29 for concrete street rehabilitation project number 5280R, and passage of a resolution requesting Board of Estimate and Taxation authorized issuance and sale of assessment bonds in the amount of $96,255 for the project. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Not from here. I'd like to open the public hearing. Is there anybody here that would like to speak on behalf of this project? Is there anyone that would like to speak here on behalf of this project? With no one here to speak on behalf of this project, I will close the public hearing and move approval of this item. I'm sorry, Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's why I'm here today for this project, which is a huge issue in our ward, and I just want to thank staff for attending 2 very well-attended neighborhood meetings. I attended one of them. I know more about concrete rehabilitation than I ever would want to know, and I actually am a big fan of the project. We'll see what happens. I'll note this is immediately adjacent to the Kenwood School. One of the reasons this project was picked is because of its adjacency to the Kenwood School and also Kenwood Park, which are both really heavily utilized amenities in the neighborhood. So again, I just wanted to thank staff for all the work they've done to get to the point where there isn't anyone here to complain about an assessment, and also for your incredible attention to detail with regard to how this will be done while the school is out and completed before the time school starts. So I just wanted to thank everyone.
Super, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you. Councilmember Reich is here, and I'm going to hand the chair over to him for the discussion items of the day.
Thank you. We will be moving to that item 19, which is the first discussion item, and it's the commercial waste study. Director Hutchinson.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, this is a receive and file item and a presentation on the waste diversion strategies for commercial, industrial, and multifamily sectors. This is simply a study, and this will be presented by Dave Herberholz with Solid Waste and Recycling, the director.
Thank you. Good morning, Director.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, committee members. My name is Dave Herberholz, and I'm the Director of Solid Waste and Recycling for the city. Pleased to be here to introduce this presentation on the commercial waste collection study. Just a quick overview. Minneapolis received an environmental assistance grant from the MPCA, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, in April of 2015. And this study was to evaluate approaches to increase the diversion of commercial, industrial, and multifamily waste within the city. And this study will be used in furthering zero waste planning efforts in the city. And we ended up contracting with Burns & McDonough, which is a consultant for the city, to conduct this study. And I'd like to introduce Bob Craigs from Burns & McDonough to provide a presentation.
Good morning. Thanks, David. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning, Chair, committee members. I want to give you an overview of the study as David outlined, and as this slide reflects, talk about the goal of the study, the tasks that were included in the study itself, identify the next steps, and in the context of gathering input, which is really critical overall to the study. As part of the study framework, we had a steering team that was composed of representatives from the city staff as well as council and the mayor's office. And so we collaborated closely in terms of making sure that we had a good sense of what some of the present goals and objectives are, as well as the present circumstances here in the city of Minneapolis. So whenever you're doing these types of studies, and I've been involved in working with local governments for over 25 years now, it's always critical to make sure that you define what the goals are as well as understand what the objectives are. Because usually the objectives are multiple and you need to be clear in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So as this outlines, the goal was to identify feasible program strategies and options. And I'll talk a little bit further about what a strategy and option is, and the full report defines both strategies and options pretty clearly. But for the city of Minneapolis to increase its diversion, and diversion is diversion from disposal of commercial, industrial, and multifamily waste. So in the solid waste industry, typically when folks talk about collecting refuse, it's either on the residential side or the non-residential side. The city of Minneapolis has municipal crews that collect refuse from homes, as well as a consortium of private haulers. On the non-residential side, which is commercial, industrial, and multifamily waste, and that is essentially waste that's generated in apartments that is 5 units or more. So the relevance of that is that's a distinction in terms of the collection programs. So in terms of the study, what was important is that we had a good sense of the existing conditions or the existing program. The report talks about that. In short, as I will mention when we talk about best practices with other communities, it's an open competitive system, which means basically the customers contract directly with their service providers. There's also a framework of ordinances that address commercial waste collection and diversion. So the second task is to research the best practices, which I'll focus on today, identify alternative strategies and options. We then worked with the steering team to identify some evaluation criteria. We had a formal stakeholder engagement process where we had some meetings to gather input, and then we'll talk about the next steps. So as I outlined, once you characterize what the existing collection program is here in the city of Minneapolis, we undertook a look at some communities to look at best practices. And with the goal of promoting diversion, reducing greenhouse gas generation in the context of climate action plan, as well as to look at the impact on roads and infrastructure, it was important to look at communities that have approached this particular issue from a variety of perspectives, so you can get a contrast and an understanding of what some of these communities are doing. The first community that we looked at, as shown on the slide, is the city of Austin. Again, similar to Minneapolis with an open competitive system, they have licensed haulers. Minneapolis licensed its haulers. They basically implemented a universal recycling ordinance. So the relevance of that is, as you can see in the slide, that it lays out specifically materials that need to be recycled, ensuring container capacity and convenient location for customers, providing education to those that are generating the waste through city's business outreach, annual reporting by haulers, and then lastly, an annual diversion plan, which is required. So again, the importance of this particular example is that the city used its ordinance as a framework whereby to establish standards in terms of providing service and recycling. One particular aspect I would note is there is a plan that's required by all generators. That's the annual diversion plan. And the funding for this particular program for the city of Austin was through what was called a clean community fee. It's a fee that's paid by residents and by businesses. The city of Austin has a 90% diversion goal that's consistent with their zero waste goal. They're presently at 42% as of 2016. In summary, this reflects setting some standards via ordinance. The second community that we looked at was the city of Portland, which has been involved in fostering waste diversion for a number of years. They have a residential program where they have franchises, which means they have zones set up for haulers. On the non-commercial or non-residential side, as I mentioned, the commercial, which is what we're focusing on, they also have an open system. As outlined on the slide, they have 37 licensed haulers, And specifically, what they used is their licensing program to set the framework to promote more waste diversion. As outlined here, they focus on what materials to collect. They require quarterly reports of the haulers and the quantities that are being collected. One of the objectives of the study, as discussed by the steering team, was to address some of the information gap as it relates to what's being recycled on the commercial side. So this particular approach uses licensing as a means in which to generate that information. They have mandatory recycling in Portland with the 75% recycling rate that they're trying to achieve. It's a unique system. All of the waste goes directly to a facility that's publicly owned, and so it has a system-wide tipping fee, so there's much more influence in terms of the overall system. It's funded specifically through what's called a per-ton fee. So every ton of waste that's collected within the city of Portland on the commercial side, there's a fee of $8.30 that is charged, and that is used to help fund the program. Again, I'll just emphasize this approach was to use the policy tool of hauler licensing in which to foster the goals that the city had laid out. Thirdly, the city of Miami, they also have an open competitive system, 11 licensed haulers. What's unique about this particular approach is that they require the haulers to actually sign what's called a franchise agreement. But it's a non-exclusive franchise agreement. And what that means, and it's outlined in more detail in our report, is that haulers that are collecting commercial waste, if they agree basically to address annual plan requirements, provide a report listing recycling accounts and quantities, and they provide this information to a third party, and they provide organics collection to select businesses, then they are essentially able to provide waste collection. It's non-exclusive, which means essentially there's no geographic district set up. It's for all haulers that are willing to follow those guidelines. But because it's an agreement with the city, it provides some more specifics and a framework. It's funded through what's called a non-exclusive franchise fee of 24% of gross receipts. And they also support this program with outreach to businesses. So again, in summary, the policy tool here is non-exclusive franchises. The last two that I'll mention before talking about the other task, first is the city of Los Angeles. As you might imagine, in California, they've been on the forefront of promoting recycling and composting for a number of years. This process started in 2006 with the city of Los Angeles. They've had many stakeholder meetings, and much analysis. Their system was an open competitive market similar to what we have here in Minneapolis. They have a number of licensed haulers. They went through a comprehensive procurement process after they actually divided the city up into collection zones. Again, one of the goals of many of these communities is to promote a reduction in the amount of vehicle miles traveled within their city, as well as to address collection efficiency to have uniform rates across the system. So the city of Los Angeles had these goals. They went through this multiple year process. They awarded basically 7 exclusive franchises for 11 zones. There's 1 hauler per zone, and there's 7 contracts that have been awarded. There are 10-year contracts with 5-year renewal options, so therefore costs associated with providing these services can be amortized by the haulers. So this again highlights what I mentioned as exclusive franchises. How is it being funded? Well, similar to other franchise concepts, there is a franchise fee that's paid by each of the haulers, and that is used both to foster the administration of the program as well as business outreach. Again, one of the fundamental goals here was for uniform rates across the city. They were seeing quite a variation, both in terms of services as well as in terms of rates. The last community that we looked at, again, keeping in mind we're providing examples of the different best practices here, was the city of San Jose. So the city of San Jose decided that it was important for them not only to look at the present commercial system, but also how materials are being processed. So they established a particular unique collection program, which is called Wet Dry, which is highlighted here on the slide. They have 2 containers that are provided to all commercial businesses, one for recyclable materials, clean wood, and reusable items, another for all of the remaining waste. The relevance of that is that that has helped them foster additional diversion. At the same time, it's created a number of challenges, and Kelly Kish and I have had a number of conversations about the challenges with this in terms of contamination. With that said, for a policy tool, what they did is they went through a competitive procurement process similar to LA, but they selected one hauler ultimately for the entire city. So they provided an exclusive commercial franchise to one hauler for a 15-year term. Their commercial rate went from 18 to 70%. I'll just reference that that includes organics, which they didn't have before, organics diversion. And the program is essentially funded through an annual franchise fee. So the contract that was entered into with the hauler that was selected includes a flat fee on an annual basis to help fund the program. Again, just to emphasize, as I mentioned on the previous examples, outreach to businesses and technical assistance is incorporated as part of those options. So those were the communities that the steering team selected to evaluate, both again to highlight some of the different policy tools as well as to get a sense of what options may be appropriate here in Minneapolis. The next step in the study was to identify evaluation criteria, and as the slide outlines, this comes back to some of the examples of objectives that the other cities looked at, and I'll quickly run through these. Of course, legal feasibility. If you followed what's taken place here in the Twin City metropolitan area, there's some other communities that have gone through different types of organized collection programs or looking at ways in which to foster more diversion. So it's critical to look at the legal feasibility. So we consulted with the county attorney's office, and there's some specific narrative in the plan that talks about that. Projected growth and diversion, obviously, more recycling and composting. I mentioned the gap as it relates to information, specifically understanding what's being collected, what's being diverted on the commercial side. So hauler reporting and rate transparency was another objective and was considered an evaluation criteria. I outlined vehicle miles traveled or transportation benefits and greenhouse gas reductions. Implementation, obviously, whatever the city, if any choice is made to move forward with any of these options or to study them further, you need to understand what the implementation is going to look like. So we've identified some of the difficulties with implementation, what are some of those activities, and then last but not least, what is the capacity to raise revenues to fund those programs, and what are the costs to the cities? I'll just emphasize this is what we would consider an initial study. So we applied these criteria to some of the strategies on the next slide. The strategies themselves, some of them were highlighted in the best practices. The steering team had a number of discussions on identifying these to look at further. And for your understanding, when you read the report, you'll see a number of tables. The tables list the strategies. The strategies can be combined to identify options, and the relevance of that is that we've applied those criteria to some of those options. The strategies that we've considered, we talked about outreach and assistance. Again, that's fundamental to any sort of program. Enhanced enforcement of city ordinances, obviously, whether you're talking about waste management or other issues, if you have ordinances that are presently in the municipal code, what does that mean for the program? How can those be used? Expand hauler licensing and establish minimum service standards. My example of Portland, they used their licensing program to establish a more defined framework. Mandatory generator recycling plans coupled with material disposal bans. Again, I should have started the presentation by saying I apologize for the waste language, as we like to say. So what that specifically means is having the generators put together a plan on how they're going to recycle and compost. That was the Austin example. Transition to a non-exclusive franchise within the city. I talked about Miami. Miami had basically its haulers sign a contract. They were awarded basically a franchise, but it was a non-exclusive franchise, so haulers could serve a number of customers within the city. Establishing an organized commercial collection within the city. Minnesota state law has what's called the Organized Collection Statute. Many of the communities that have undertaken organized collection have looked at this particular statute in great detail. There's a number of ways to define organized commercial collection. We've left this in terms of those terms. You can look at LA and San Jose as a form of organized commercial collection, but it's important to understand that that could be exclusive franchises, but there's some very prescriptive requirements in the state law associated with organizing commercial collection. And then lastly, of course, municipalization of commercial collection. There's a handful of communities around the country that actually collect commercial waste similar to collecting residential waste here. We took those strategies, we combined them into a number of options. Those options, again, are provided in the report. We applied the evaluation criteria to get some sense of how they would measure up as it compares to those objectives. And I talked about those objectives. We talked about reducing vehicle miles traveled. We talked about waste diversion. We've talked about trying to have some more transparency as it relates to rates, as it relates to what's being collected. So based on the analysis that was done to date, the next steps are to establish an internal working group to evaluate the preferred options. I talked about a number of strategies. Hopefully it wasn't a dizzying number, but again, we combined those into some options to consider. Evaluate some preferred options in more detail, look at the benefits and drawbacks. As Dave outlined, within the framework of the city's zero waste goals, which recycling and composting of 80% by 2030 is what the council basically moved forward in 2015, to continue work with all the stakeholders. On March 23rd, we had 2 stakeholder meetings. We had representatives from the Multifamily Housing Association, representatives from the hauler community, and representatives from a number of different business types. There's a summary of the feedback provided. I presented the report with the support from the staff, and the summary is in the appendix in the report. The last step that is being identified is to move forward with the completion of the city's zero waste plan. Again, in the context of the 80% goal, this particular study talks about some of those policy tools that could be used in context with some others and in cooperation with others to move the city forward. With that, I'll stop and try to answer any questions. And again, thank you.
Any questions for the presentation? Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I have a few questions, and of course, it's very complicated. It also, I'm impressed by how there might be gray areas between some of these different models. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are in terms of getting the same kind of results using a licensed option, to license the haulers, put more requirements on the license versus going to the franchise. Because it sounded like some of the cities, I think it was, is Austin the ones that's going with the license, were able to get a pretty good performance. And so what's the distinction between when they actually go to a franchise, and are there benefits? Can we require more from the franchise, or is there a way we can get everything we maybe want through the licensing?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Committee Member Gordon, I think you just described there's a whole gamut of options that we have. I think what we potentially can do is we've got a licensing system there that maybe needs a little more refinement. The whole idea is to just find out what the whole scenario is with the commercial, multifamily, and industrial area, information gathering. So I think any of these strategies and options potentially, the more impactful they can be in going from targeted education to the far end of franchising. As you expand that, you get into more and more work, more and more data that's obtained, and more impact.
Okay, so I guess I'm right in guessing there's some flexibility, and also even in the franchise fee versus the cost of your license in terms of recovering some of our costs. I'm also curious about if there was a city you looked at that was fully municipalized. I mean, in your options A through G, the last one that you land on, and I have to say, when you look at that one, you look at the projected growth and diversion, it's high. You look at the hauler reporting rate, it's high. The transportation benefits in terms of greenhouse gases, it's high. That's a very appealing one. In fact, the last two, F and G, are really the only ones that scored high on those three criteria that were so important to me. But is there a city that's municipalized out there that you looked at as well to see how it's working?
So Councilmember Gordon, as part of this study, we did not. I'll mention that there's very few large cities that have basically municipalized their commercial collection. Those that have are typically much smaller than the city of Minneapolis. There's probably a number of reasons for that, but the typical approach, as we outlined, is in terms of the best management practices are the communities that we basically provided in the report.
Okay, and I also noticed that option F in the report, it's the main new strategy there is the organized collection, and I'm assuming that the difference there is the assumption is that means it has some kind of an exclusive franchise system.
Yeah, there's a number of different approaches under organized collection, and in the legal feasibility portion of the report talks about when the organized collection statute would apply. You can have everything from, like we laid out in terms of Los Angeles, where you would divide the area up into zones and have one particular entity serve that. There's actually some communities that have divided the area, the commercial area, up into zones, and then have had a limited number of haulers to provide some competition within each of those zones as another option. I think some of the challenges is what is considered organized collection and what is not, and we've tried to begin evaluating some of that. The word franchise, I think, implies organized collection.
Very good. I was also curious about if you have any more details you can share with us about Los Angeles's experience making the transition. I'm assuming they had no franchises for a while. It was kind of the free-for-all like we have in the commercial side in Minneapolis now. Was that a difficult transition for them to get?
Yes, it took them, as I might have mentioned, or I might have mentioned it quickly, they started in 2006, and in July 1st, I believe, is they're actually going through the implementation process. So they had a number of stakeholder meetings, but to answer your question directly, it was an open competitive system with a number of licensed haulers. On the residential side, they actually had franchises, but on the commercial side, it was an open system. So they went through a number of stakeholder meetings. They went through a comprehensive public procurement process whereby they laid out what those zones were going to be. And then they evaluated it on a competitive basis. And as I mentioned in the presentation, they selected a number of haulers to serve the 11 zones. They also had some zones that were defined, Councilmember Gordon, to basically be more compatible with the smaller haulers, which is what some communities have done. So there's a number of ways in which you can go about it. So the short answer, it was a comprehensive process, and implementation is now taking place.
Sounds like they took a slow and steady approach to get there. So I appreciate that. I appreciate all the work that you put into this report. Also, I was able to attend one of the stakeholder meetings and been involved in it. And I think it's been very interesting. It's been very eye-opening, I think, for the city and for everybody to say, let's take a look at this. It's pretty mind-boggling to look at all the unknowns that have been out there for so long. We have no idea how much waste we're generating from these sources. We have no idea where it's going. And so if we actually talk about getting to zero waste, we're going to need to do something so that we can get a better understanding of this and also help with more diversion. And the report points in the direction of where we can get more diversion. And so I look forward to learning more. I have a staff direction, but I think I'll wait till there's more questions. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Councilmember Galena.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I wonder if you could go kind of backwards to that slide where you got the different alternative strategies and options. So I will be interested with the next steps. It seems like a lot of the the challenges are really, we don't have a lot of data that would be helpful. So that was a really interesting part of the report, actually, is that we kind of have a dearth of data. And it would be better to kind of understand the landscape better. I don't know how you solve that. Or maybe that's a question for your work group that you are proposing to set up, whether it is better to kind of go slower to make sure you have a better data set, or just pick one of the strategies to move forward on, because anyway, the more time you're losing the more time you take, although the more data you have, I suppose, the better you can evaluate the options. A lot of the challenges seem to me to be more, though, with kind of the legal issues, as well as the interplay with what we think might be some state law or concerns with the state legislature, and then how tough it is to organize. So maybe you want to weigh in on that, but I mean, that's what it seemed to me. You kind of have these options. You're able to show this is the highest impact. It would be a struggle for me to think we could really achieve municipalization, just kind of knowing the landscape at the state and some of the challenges that have appeared already just to organize collection by bipartisan groups of legislators. So maybe you can tell me a little of your thoughts on what the team will spend most of its time on. Is it those legal and organizing challenges, or is it more on the data end, which also we don't have a great picture of?
Mr. Chair, Committee Member Glidden, yes, I would think that initially the working group would look for a mechanism to get more data, more reporting, and that could come in a number of ways, whether it's in licensing requirements that would require annual reporting as just one of the examples. And as you stated, as we progress down the list of strategies here, there's definitely more legal framework that has to be addressed, and the probably more difficulty and more concentrated discussion that needs to be taken. And just from our standpoint, we've been through the organized collection process on the residential end, and it is very, very time consuming, very direct on steps that you need to take, and we realize that in moving forward on this, but I think it would potentially be fleshed out in the internal working group.
How long do you think it will take for the internal working group to come back with a more specific recommendation on actions to take?
Right now, I don't know if I really have the answer to that, because we haven't, we've got an idea of what the composition of that internal working group would be, but it stretches over multiple departments, and I guess it's dependent on scheduling and kind of an agenda that the group may have.
Okay. I mean, just kind of, again, looking at the available impact without knowing more, I kind of really hope that we end up at least on the transition to a non-exclusive franchise within the city, or established organized commercial collection. I know those are both pretty big bites to take off, but just to kind of put that out there. Then my last question, I know Councilmember Gordon has this staff direction about incorporating the study into the zero waste plan. And I was trying to remember, has there ever been any presentation to a council committee about the zero waste plan and kind of what is happening with that? I feel like it's an important framework, but we haven't really had a public interaction with it, at least to my memory. And that would actually present, I don't know the status of it, but it seems like it is an important framework to place major efforts like this within. So we feel like the different strategies we invest in at the city to achieve zero waste, which right now is just kind of words, really high level goal, but placing them within a plan framework would be really helpful. It's kind of like the climate action plan that has been very helpful to directing multiple levels of significant work.
Mr. Chair, Committee Member Glidden, yes, we have a an idea of moving towards a zero waste plan. And there's funds that are out there for us to go ahead and do some study there. Some changes within the mayor's office. So we've got Alston Sleets, who's a new sustainability policy aide within the mayor's office. He'll be working on zero waste, and we plan on meeting very soon to reconvene on discussion to have a draft plan, zero waste plan.
Right. And I appreciate that this has been a mayor's initiative, and it's important to have the mayor's support and heft and all those things in there. But I will say, I know that there are council members who are identified to assist with this, and I feel like identifying a way that there is more of a council touch to this, because in the end of the day, the council does the official actions of the city to adopt policy and all these other kinds of things. And so I would appreciate, and this is a request to the chair maybe, if we could identify how that pathway can come here, even if it's to set us more on a process pathway, to make sure we do have this framework that can be adopted as a city proposal to kind of move forward our actions in a bigger picture way.
Councilmember Bender?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wondered if you could talk more about the customer end, the producers of waste, and help me understand how that fits into the strategies around sort of increasing diversion. So I've a couple of examples of how I've thought about this. Number one, I have a huge number of apartment buildings in my ward that don't currently have city collection. So if we switch to a different strategy on the hauler end, how would that transition happen on the property owner and apartment manager side is one question. And then another question I had was, as we were designing and approving, not us designing, as developers and project teams are coming through with new buildings through our approval process, I also often wonder if our standards are accommodating current desires and maybe future regulations around requiring recycling and composting. So that's another question where the city touches our new building construction. And I guess that the final question is like, do any of these different strategies require change on the producer end of waste?
Mr. Chair, Committee Member Bender. Yes, I guess I see your question as kind of threefold. The idea of there's ordinances in play right now with multifamily buildings that require recycling to be offered. And Kelly Kisher is the recycling coordinator in case I need some backup here. So we do have some enforcement over that. So when we're approached by customers that may live in the multifamilies about them not having accessibility to recycling, we are able to then engage that multifamily unit. And so there are mechanisms right now as far as ordinance. Your second, well, I guess with that only addresses recycling right now. There is a potential in the future to address other items such as organics. That kind of followed suit with us getting into the one sort recycling. Now that we're into organics, that could very well change in the future too. So yes, the ordinances could be modified, new ordinances put into play. And help me with the second part of your question.
Are there standards that we should consider for new buildings that would enable them to better meet our regulations?
We are involved with that right now. I don't know if Kelly wants to speak a little further, but with new structures, the challenge is that a lot of the older and retrofitted buildings, there's continued space constraints within the city. And the idea that the area that's set aside for waste diversion is limited. And as far as some of the high-rise units, the idea of getting that material from an upper floor to down at point of collection can be very difficult. So in new buildings, there's discussion about having multiple chutes for garbage, recycling, organics that would be put into a standard. You can come up. It'd probably be good for Kelly to expand on it, Mr. Chair. Is that all right?
Please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. In regards to new buildings, there was, I believe this past year, a direction for the engineers to actually interpret state building codes slightly different. So right now, new buildings are required to have at least that chute for recycling. As you know or may not know, Hennepin County currently offers a lot of technical assistance to multi-units to improve or add recycling organics programs. As you go through the different strategies and options outlined in the study, part of what the work group would do, we envision, is to prioritize which ones we think are going to get us the most diversion, the best data. And as Dave had mentioned, we currently do enforce multi-unit recycling, but it's on a complaint basis only. So we don't have the ability to go out there and make sure there is recycling at all of the current properties. So things like the mandatory recycling plans would give us, the ability to have another way to identify who is or who is not recycling, who needs help. So it's a lot to think through, and that's part of why the working group would go through that. And then in terms of your first question, going back to what requirements would there be of the property owners? There will be, with any change or implementation, roll out to one sort, there was, a timeline schedule identified of when we were pulling or delivering the carts to your area. There would have to be something set up along those lines too for whatever method was chosen to move forward with. Thank you.
Councilmember Yang?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is just with regards to, I believe there was a stakeholder survey or something of that nature, and I remember the response rates when we were getting briefed was not very good. And did it improve, over that short time period, or did the, response rates give us good data?
So, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Yang, what we initiated at the beginning of the project was a survey of random businesses within Minneapolis. I should say it was structured where we surveyed businesses from different categories within Minneapolis to try to get a sense of some of their challenges and some of their perspectives as it relates to both solid waste management, recycling, and if they are doing some composting. The report talks about the efforts that we took. It had a very limited response rate. We then moved forward with the stakeholder meetings and talked further on March 23rd, as I mentioned, with the number of representatives that were at the meeting, and the next steps outline the need to continue to do more stakeholder engagement for all of those reasons.
And can I ask, why do you think, the response rates were so low?
Probably a combination of things. Making sure that the information got to the right individual who could answer the questions like any survey. Also, just the right timing. Councilmember Yang, in terms of that information going out, I think in the context of many things last year, it was pretty challenging relative to the overall political climate and information going out. Again, this is Bob speaking. But at the same time, the surveys that have been effective, we just conducted one for another community who's going through this similar process, and we actually approached it by using, believe it or not, a telephone survey, where there's databases now that allow you to randomly survey folks via their cell phones. And we've seen that to be another way in which to gather information. So, long-winded answer to your question. Again, I think at this point in time, we weren't asking for feedback on a particular option. We were asking for some feedback similar to what Kelly's providing in terms of some of the challenges that businesses have.
Okay, and with regards to these identified alternative strategies and options, what I see is that in some ways, it's structure or it's organization or it's penalties, but I'm wondering, are we thinking about incentives? And just to throw out a crazy idea, that we used to have. People used to, or some people now even, within my ward, they talk about this fantasy land where, we used to give a $7 credit for recycling and all that stuff. Have we even thought about anything like that? Because I think, the one big thing about, getting to zero waste is I think the structures and things like that are great. But I mean, one other thing that we have to think about is just human behavior. I mean, how do we change human behavior so that people actually recycle or compost or do those things that we want? And how do we do it in a positive way instead of just, whacking them with a penalty?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Committee Member Yang, we do have incentives out there right now, which I guess are maybe small. I guess an example of it would be in our residential program there, maybe not applicable to this, but I'll get into one of those, with just the size of your solid waste cart. So you pay $2 for the small cart and $5 for the large cart. So there's a small incentive there to lessen the amount of waste that you're putting out. From the commercial, multifamily, and industrial standpoint, I think the incentive out there is the solid waste tax. You get taxed on the garbage. If you recycle, you don't get taxed on that.
Right. And my sense of that, though, and I say this jokingly, I mean, people still have to pay, and so it doesn't feel like it's an incentive. But no, I appreciate that. I mean, I just think that, when we think about getting into zero waste, I mean, we have to really think about just changing people's behaviors. And, I remember when I started out a couple of years ago, I mean, I went with our trash haulers to, do a segment of Ward 5. And just remember, I mean, the amount of recycling that was in the garbage, and it just was pretty stark, I thought. And, it just seemed like it was a situation where, for folks, I mean, it just was much more convenient to throw in the trash than just to recycle. And it was just kind of like a mental thing that really just separated a person who recycles from just a person who doesn't, in terms of just, thinking about it, not people's beliefs about recycling. It's more so just, it was convenient. And so just thinking, like, how do we change those things and make it a lot easier for people to, know that recycling is good or composting is good for them?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that from our standpoint, like our residential program, I think education is definitely the key to get individuals and businesses to know what they can do to lessen the financial impact on how they look at their waste. I think that would be delved into with the internal working group, and I do fully believe in education before penalties. So we'll go with that route.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon?
Thank you very much. Councilmember Glidden's questions were reminding me of some past events, and we actually passed a resolution where the council called out the zero waste plan in July of 2015. In that resolution, we called in a report back in the spring of 2016 with the zero waste plan. So you can imagine that we're a little behind schedule. Maybe you can't imagine, but this is me being really frustrated about it. I don't know why it's taken. I wish it hadn't taken this long. I guess I can understand some of the reasons. I think this study has been a key piece to get done to move forward on that, so I really appreciate that. But I just wanted to clarify that the council has weighed in on it. We have kind of brought that in. The resolution was really when we were setting our goals and target. Councilmember Reich and I authored it, and but that's when we said we will now participate in the zero waste plan that we acknowledged was being led by the mayor's office. So I'm excited to pick that up and move forward and shake off whatever frustration might be here, because it's taken us a while to get to this point. Ideally, I guess we would have had more things in place now as we're preparing for the budget for 2018, so we could have been thinking about what are we going to need so that we can actually be implementing our zero waste plan. But I think instead, what we're now is we have a commitment. We have new staff in the mayor's office. We have this information. So, and I believe we even have a little money in the budget to get some help writing our zero waste plan over the next few months. Not that it's going to be done in September. I'm not necessarily putting that out there, but there is a staff direction before you that is following up on this report, where, and I'll read it to you now so we can, and then I'll move it. It would be directing solid waste and recycling staff to establish an internal working group to evaluate options of the commercial waste collection study to be incorporated into the zero waste plan, and return to the Transportation and Public Works Committee with recommendations for next steps no later than September 12th, 2017. And so that's the motion. And the next steps could be make sure they're incorporated into the final draft of the zero waste plan or something, which I think we're all fully expecting and aiming to get done this year. Nod your heads if you think we can pull it off. which would be fantastic. And I think there's other things we can do along the way. And of course, we have been doing other things to divert waste to get to zero waste, even though we don't have our comprehensive plan. And I want to admit that and acknowledge that we've done work on getting rid of some material that can't be recycled and disposed of. We've done a lot of work on our compost program and getting that moving forward. And there may even be some other ordinances I know that I've been considering looking at composting as a requirement for apartment buildings. We have lots of renters that are reaching out to us and saying, why can't I compost in my building? The services are provided elsewhere. So there's other things that we can do. But I thought that it might be nice to have to touch back again on September 12th. And actually, I thank Mr. Herbert Holtz and Public Works for working with me on the staff direction. So I'll move that and put that out there. And thanks for your time.
Yeah, I'll just include that with the receive and file, if that's okay with that, because it's very consistent with the objectives as laid out at the very end of the presentation. And I think something that was very key was touched on, in terms of how the work gets done with City Council. I mean, this is going to be a key, if not the central feature to zero waste. I mean, in terms of making a change, a big change, as contemplated here. And so I think data is going to be critical. I think obviously there's some legal analysis and there's all those things that we have to do to make sure what we're doing is consistent with state law, et cetera. But the data, so we know where we're at, can very well inform where we want to go. And where we're at with good data can very much shine light on how best to get to the goals that we want. I think the goals are already there. They're broad, they're general, they're ambitious, but the detail from A to B is the key task before us, and I think data is the lifeblood of that exercise. But I think the data is not just an inherently valuable thing. I think that this need for data that we've outlined here in this report is an invitation. It's an invitation to people in the industry, many of them who are here, to partner with us, because that's where our most direct source of data will come from. And in that spirit of partnership, I think we can really fashion how we can meet our goals together, because at the end of the day, it's probably going to be a partnership moving forward one way or the other. So I think that's another example of how we need the data. Invaluable stuff, but it's also a way to collaborate. It's the means to collaborate. And so with that, I will, I think I'm being...
Mr. Chair, I have one comment I forgot to. Oh, go ahead, Director
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I want to thank you for your extremely high level of interest in this work. The team has worked very hard on this commercial waste study. A couple takeaways that we are committing to you is to coordinate with the mayor's office effort on zero waste, to understand their timeline and how our work fits into it, to look at both data as well as additional and continued stakeholder work as we take the foundations of the information that is presented to us here and develop this further with input from others and in working together with the council.
Councilmember Gordon?
I forgot one comment that I was going to make. Even though we're calling this an internal work group, of course, we understand that internal work group will have to keep maintaining communications and connections to our external stakeholders so that they can keep informing the process that we're doing.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that expectation. So with that, good commentary, good report on the motion to forward the staff direction and the receive and file of the report. Any further discussion? See none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries.
Thank you.
Onward. Thank you. We move to item 20, pedestrian crosswalk marking presentation.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, as you know, safety is one of our primary goals for our residents and visitors to the city, and pedestrian safety in particular. I'm personally very proud of the work of both the Transportation Planning and Programming Division and Traffic and Parking Services working together to make an important change in how we handle pedestrian crosswalks. So presenting today is Matthew Durdall with Transportation Planning and Programming and Steve Mosing with Traffic and Parking Services.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, committee members. Again, my name is Matthew Durdall. I'm the Bicycle and Pedestrian Coordinator in the Transportation Planning and Programming Division. Steve Mosing and I are going to provide an overview of a change in our crosswalk marking framework. Very quickly, the reason that we mark crosswalks is to provide a more visible, more comfortable crossing for people. And this change that we're going to discuss today is really about aligning with best practices. First, our pedestrian master plan, you can see the graphic on the right, shows the two basic ways that we mark crosswalks in Minneapolis. On the top is the parallel transverse lines that basically outlines where the crosswalk marking is. And on the bottom is the continental or zebra crosswalk markings, which are much more visible. And so the pedestrian master plan has a lot of language in there about a goal to increase the visibility of crosswalk markings. And then I also want to highlight NACTO, which is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. In their Urban Street Design Guide, they discuss that continental or zebra markings are preferable to other forms of crossings. The last point that I'll make before turning it over to Steve is that there is quite a bit of interest and support in improving crosswalk markings in Minneapolis. We've brought this to the Pedestrian Advisory Committee, and they were very supportive of this change, as well as other ways to improve street crossings in Minneapolis. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve Mosley.
Good morning, Steve Mosing, Traffic Operations Engineer for Public Works. So what's happening in the field? What's happening on the street? So what we are doing is on the left side, you'll see a picture of the old parallel line crosswalk, which will be discontinued, no longer a city standard. And what you see on the right is the new crosswalk that will become the city standard, which we're calling the Minneapolis Zebra Crosswalk. So we actually started this in 2016 with roadway reconstruction, mill and overlay, and seal coat projects. So in conjunction with those projects, we started putting in the new standard. And we are going to expand that this year to include nearly all the crosswalks in the city of Minneapolis. Will get this new standard. I say nearly all because there are portions of the parkway which will be evaluated through an audit this year, and we'll take the results of that audit and implement zebra crosswalks on the parkway for next year. So overall, there are about 3,800 crosswalks in the city of Minneapolis. City forces maintain crosswalks on county roadways, city roadways, and the parkway. MnDOT maintains the crosswalks on the trunk highway system. So a big reason for this change is to make it feasible is the equipment. So what we wanted to do is 3,300 of the 3,800 crosswalks in the city are put in using paint. So that is not a durable marking. Paint has to be redone every year. And with the machines that we had or the equipment we had to do the parallel line crosswalks, it just wasn't feasible to do those crosswalks in the new standard. So our goal was to look at our method of installation to make it as efficient as it could be, just like the parallel line crosswalk. And so what our painting crews did is they specified and spec'd some custom-made equipment that allows us to paint the crosswalks in an efficient manner, much like the parallel lines. So how are we going to get this done? Well, we have 3 programs that we want to implement this year to put in the Minneapolis Zebra crosswalks at the nearly 3,800 locations in the city. And so the first program would be to do what we did last year, and that's install them with the reconstruction, mill and overlay, and seal coat projects. So in conjunction with those projects, we'll be putting in marked crosswalks. And the key about those projects is we won't be putting them in paint. We'll be putting them in durable markings. So if you look at the pictures there, it looks like they're putting in poly preform, which is like a tape adhesive. You get about 5 years durability out of that material, and it's highly visible and reflective. So an independent crosswalk program. So a portion of the crosswalks that won't be done as part of the 5-year program, roadway program schedule, we're going to take a portion of those and install durable crosswalks at those locations. So that's not all the crosswalks, it's a certain portion of them outside of that 5-year plan. And again, we'll be using durable crosswalks to put those in as well. So you can look at the pictures. We have a product called MMA that we're very happy with so far that we'll be using. And in the bottom right, you see city crews putting in thermoplastic. I think that's at 31st and Girard. that's actually melted into the pavement. So all crosswalks that aren't part of the roadway reconstruction program or the independent program will be painted. So again, that's just a touch over 3,000 crosswalks. We'll be putting in the new standard with paint. And so if you look at the pictures, the one on the left shows a city crew outlining the crosswalk. And then if I can get this to work on the right, you can see how the crosswalk's put in. Now, it's just a simple stripe, but a lot of thought went into that simple stripe. And so, again, at about 38 or a little over 3,000 crosswalks in the city, paint will be the method, and that will be something that we have to come back and do every year. So just a couple photographs on the before and after. This is 3rd Avenue South at 11th Street. You can see the different look between the parallel lines and the zebra crosswalks. You know, my observations have been that the zebra crosswalks better define the intersections. And so there's kind of a summary of the before after, but also moving forward. We started in 2016 with roadway projects. In 2017, we're expanded to generally call all crosswalks in the city with the exception of some on the Parkway. And as we move forward, we're going to look at the durability of crosswalks, the visibility, the method of installation, the cost, so that we can fine tune our program over the next few years. So with that, questions?
Any questions per the presentation? Councilmember Glidden.
Thanks. Just because you're up here really on a different aspect of the crosswalks, I just wanted to put out there a couple of very common questions I get to say, you know, maybe we could make the answers to these a little bit more easily available, or maybe you're kind of working through what are some of the answers to these. So I get a lot of requests for crosswalks. I'm sure that you hear that from all over the city. And having a better understanding or a place on the website to go to where Public Works establishes, you know, what are its criteria for placing crosswalks? Is it a safety criteria? Is it a financial criteria? Is it, you know, and then people ask all these follow-up questions such as, could we pay for it ourselves? And things like that. And it's because it's a very desired, people are continuously thinking about how to improve, especially in the residential neighborhoods, what they believe are pedestrian safety issues. So it comes from a very important and real place, and I think there's a lot of ways that Public Works is changing how it responds to those, but I just kind of put that out there because I know you get those requests a lot, and they come to me, and then I pass them on to staff. And so thinking about how we communicate either kind of where we're at today, but also we're continuing to evaluate this. I mean, I just don't know what all is kind of going in. The second thing that I often get requests about crosswalks is kind of similar to the question about could we pay for it ourselves or do it ourselves. Is just personally, I have a lot of requests from neighbors about could we create an artistic or unique looking crosswalk. So we do have a program in the city that is paint the intersection. I don't know all the standards for that. I know Public Works does some evaluation of what are the appropriate locations for that and things. I'll just say I know we've had this program for some time, but I don't know that anything has ever been approved. It may be for an artistically designed crosswalk, which I know there are standards that need to be met for the crosswalk to be safe and appropriate and all those kinds of things. But anyway, I don't know if you're getting a lot of those questions. Somehow I seem to get a fair number of those questions. But so just to kind of put that out there, another sort of community, again, it's not the point of your report, but I'll just say people will see the report and it kind of spurs some other questions that are common questions about crosswalks because it's a very desired, visible means of, you know, how are we trying to improve pedestrian safety?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Glidden, so you bring up two very good comments, and we get over 400 crosswalk requests a year to our division through a lot of different means, 311s from council offices. And there's a lot of discussion with regard to a criteria as well as information to put out there for the public to consume to better understand crosswalks. And so that's all part of a discussion that we hope to conclude and bring out at a later time. But we completely understand what you had stated.
Yeah, and the notion to just maybe have it out there, an available location might be helpful. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really excited about this, so thank you so much for doing this. And I think maybe echoing Councilmember Glidden's comment, the number one question or comment or email or call to my office is about traffic safety in neighborhoods by a lot. And we often are communicating with staff about these sort of one-off intersections, but they're common problems. So I think this is such a great approach to take this more citywide system approach to thinking about ways that we can, as a citywide system, improve pedestrian safety and traffic safety. Some of the other things we hear a lot about are sight distances at corners in the sort of heavily parked up neighborhoods. So often cars are parking right up to the curb. And so when you're driving or biking or walking along the street, you can't see what's coming. We often get requests for crossings as well. We've gotten feedback about the difficulty of using our Paint the Pavement program and just sort of the fees and the expenses that go with it. One of my neighborhood organizations sponsored one and had a lot of trouble getting it done. So I think, again, just the more that we can help work proactively with constituents on more of a system level, I think that will help free up staff time as well, just because I know my office alone is and you've been very responsive. Public Works has been very responsive in helping solve these little problems in specific intersections when you can. But I know there's a high volume. So I'm excited to see more of this system approach to safety.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. And we could talk about a lot of other things about pedestrian crossing and signalization and safety and where we put our priorities, but I just wanted I've been trying not to do that. But I did want to mention this one map that you had, which was called the Durable Crosswalk Program Candidates. And I'm wondering if there's anything we can tell our constituents or residents that they can do to support one of the candidates, and how you're going to decide ultimately on those candidates and when they get the durable crosswalk treatments or not, or what should we do with that map?
So, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, we have 3,800 crosswalks in the city, and to try to tabulate a priority system and let me know if I'm not answering your question correctly, was quite an extensive effort. So what we did, and the mill and overlay and the reconstruction projects are kind of the simple aspect of this. It's all part of that 5-year program, which is developed so those crosswalks are good. I think the big piece of this, and the piece that staff worked hard on, was outside of that program, where do we start to put in the durable markings? And so what staff did as best they could is they tried to go to the crosswalks, which we have data for, and if we don't have data for, just observationally can conclude that it's a high pedestrian area, and go geographically through the city and try to make it as even as possible with the durable crosswalk program. Now, that's the independent program. Now, the painted crosswalks, of course, every intersection outside of those 2 programs will get that. So you'll see the visibility of those crosswalks right away this year. And actually, with the painted crosswalk program, they're up in North Minneapolis painting now. They'll be in downtown next, then they go northeast, southeast, and then they'll finish up in south. And so that will all be completed this year. So as far as wavering within the durable crosswalk program, I mean, I think we're open to that. If there's some logical explanation why one crosswalk would be wanted over another. And I'm not sure, Councilmember, if I answered your question.
So that was valuable information. So when they're called a candidate for 2018, that means if everything goes as planned and the budget's provided, that's when it will be put in, is in 2018.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's what we'll tell people is tentatively scheduled for those years. I mean, that's what we can tell them, or we can look it up ourselves when they're calling about a crosswalk, and we say, great news, in 2020, it's going to be done.
And the map does say subject to change, but.
Yep, I understand. So thanks for that clarification.
Any other questions or comments? Well, obviously, this is a well-received report. We continue to expand what we do out in the community, both in terms of our scope and scale of the program, but we're also simultaneously upping the quality of our work out there. So it's those two dynamics simultaneously happening is definitely something I think is something the public eagerly will receive. And clearly, based on the council, my peers up here, there's a lot of public interest, so it'll be work well received. But in the spirit of tangents, I just wanted to say, you know, you could really mine some of these pictures for youth recruitment to Public Works. We already got the message out there that Public Works is a cool job. It's a good job working for the city's deeply meaningful work. But here you got some great graphics. I mean, this program alone, you could potentially be working on one of these customized vehicles, really tricked out equipment, and yeah, flamethrowers. You could potentially be using a flamethrower at work. And so, I don't know, junior high kids might eat that up. So think about that for our recruitment material. With that, I believe this is a report, it was a receive and file. All in favor of the receive and file, say aye.
Aye.
Dissenting name, that carries. Thank you very much. And our final item is a important resolution with a very significant recognition of the work that we saw today and just some small aspects that this department does. So I'm going to read it for the public record. This is declaring week of May 21st, 2017 as National Public Works Week. And whereas the American Public Works Association celebrates its 57th annual Public Works Week, which will be held the third week in May with the theme Public Works Connects Us. And whereas National Public Works Week is a celebration of employees who play a crucial role and are dedicated in strengthening our community, designing and maintaining infrastructures, and improving our quality of life. And whereas Public Works professionals focus on infrastructure, facilities, services that are vital to the importance to a sustainable and resilient city. And whereas Minneapolis Public Works employees maintain thousands of miles of streets, bikeways, sidewalks, water, storm, and sanitary pipes and bridges that connect us. Whereas the support of an understanding and informed citizenry is vital to the efficient operation of public works systems and programs such as water, sewers, streets, solid waste collection. And whereas the health, safety, and comfort of this community greatly depends on these facilities and services. And whereas the quality and effectiveness of these facilities, as well as their planning, design, construction, are vitally dependent upon the efforts and skill of the public works officials. And whereas the efficiency of the qualified and dedicated personnel who staff the Public Works Department is materially influenced by the people's attitudes and understanding of the importance of the work they perform. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the City Council and the City of Minneapolis that the City Council acknowledges the significant daily contribution that the employees within Public Works Department of the City of Minneapolis provide to the citizens and businesses throughout the city during National Public Works Week. Well done.